Now, a major security scare occurred at Tambo International Airport, where a passenger managed to board a flight with deactivated hand grenades in their luggage. Airports company South Africa, AXA, has launched an investigation, but the incident raises serious concerns about the effectiveness of airport security screening. Let's talk to Aviation Analyst Dr. Guy Leitch about this and more. Guy, good morning. Good morning to you, actually, then. What do you think happened here?
Yeah, hi, good morning to you and your viewers. Well, I'm afraid that we don't know exactly what happened, but as far as I know, these so-called deactivated grenades were actually in the checked baggage and not in the carry-on baggage. And that makes a huge difference because obviously the standards of security for checked baggage are slightly different. In other words, you don't want to be able to have somebody take a bomb on board that they can then activate in their checked bag. But if it goes into the hold, well, then it goes into the hold. But there are all sorts of protocols and requirements in place for hold baggage. And these include, obviously, X-rays. Most of the time, the baggage security checks include sniffer dogs to check out for any explosives. Now, I need to point out that everyone talks about these hand grenades as though they are significant. There's a real chance that they were not. They were just dummy hand grenades used for training purposes, so they may not have had any explosives in them at all, which is one of the reasons why they would probably have been missed by sniffer dogs if there were sniffer dogs, and why they might not have been identified immediately on the X-rays.
Okay, that's actually very interesting. So should there be serious concern then about this? And I say that because while they were just training grenades, most presumably here, they weren't or didn't have any kind of detonation in them, gunpowder of any sort, didn't have any detectable, particularly by dogs, semblance of being an actual grenade then. Should there then be any kind of concern here, or should we be looking to AXA's protocol and wondering whether, if anything more serious, could actually be slipping through?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways I need to answer this question. The first is that there's increasing signs or evidence or just the belief that actually airport security is more about the show than the reality. It's a theater of security. People go through the motions of checking all the baggage and so on. And it's more for customer or passenger confidence than in a response to any real threat. Now, it's really interesting to discuss this because, in fact, there hasn't been a life lost to a bomb on board since 2006, and there've been very, very few incidences at all of serious breaches of security. Obviously, 9/11 was different, but that was again an entirely different threat that wasn't perceived, real at the time, and was dealt with by reinforcing the cockpit doors. But I mean, since 1976, when security first became a threat, when the first aircraft was hijacked and the intention was to fly it to Cuba, it's been either airport security has been incredibly effective, or there is no real threat. And I think that one of the signs we're seeing now of the fact that it's been wound down a lot is the famous LAGs, which are liquid aerosols and gas checks, which were introduced after the as I think it was the Unabomber, try to make a bomb out of hairspray and perfumes that he'd brought on board. Those lag checks are now being discarded by airlines around the world. We haven't got there with South African security checks yet, but I expect to get there. The other factor is there another problem? Is there a weakness in our own checks? I suspect there is, because we're in the middle of a very unpleasant political fight between ACS, which is the aircraft cargo handling service, which is contracted to do these services, and AXA, which runs the airports. And indeed, AXA has been trying to get rid of ACS for the last couple of years, and yet they had their case thrown out of court about a month or two ago, 6 weeks ago. And this may be yet another ploy by AXA to try and unseat ACS from doing these checks. So it's very hard to get to the bottom of what's going on at this stage.
Yeah, and one wonders then if you have a situation like this happening, the fear factor could perhaps be returning. Could you see? And I know you said it could be merely cosmetic even. But one thing's for sure is that passengers do themselves also get a little bit worrisome and a little bit fearful here. Tell me, Guy, what is a live battery being in your carry-on luggage? What does that change?
Well, the whole issue of lithium batteries is fraught because we have seen a regular series of spontaneous combustions of batteries in computers or particularly games. And the real problem lies when they start getting charged from the aircraft's own systems, when you can plug in a charger into a USB port. But that's also been largely controlled. A cabin crew are trained to deal with a spontaneous lithium battery blaze. They've got bags and fireproof bags that they can put the appliance into, which will put it out. Boeing had a problem with lithium batteries 10 years ago when they introduced the Boeing 787 into service. But all of these risks have been properly managed away out of significance. And let me just point out that flying is still 100 times safer than the drive to the airport. So the risk is really very small indeed. But interestingly enough, the risk that we're seeing emerging or growing rapidly, depending on some assumptions that you need to make, is that of pilot suicide. There's increasing evidence that the Air India crash was pilot suicide. The loss of the MH370 Boeing 777 nearly 10 years ago now is almost certainly pilot suicide. And of course, there have been many others, including 2 in Southern Africa. So that's the real risk that the security vetting process now has to deal with.
Yeah, look, Guy, I can fully attest to, the conversation consistently being had. I've spoken to the heads of Boeing as well, even, and the conversation is still around how flying is still the most reliable, as you've made note of yourself then just a moment ago. But with every airline crash, particularly when you have so many issues happening out of Boeing especially, that surely erodes some confidence in just how safe flying is.
Well, of course it does, because perceptions are real. That's what people feel. And if people become scared of flying, and people are naturally scared of flying. I mean, if you think about it, you're strapped into a seat in a very lightweight and possibly thin aluminium tube, doing almost 1,000 kilometers an hour through the sky, 10,000 meters above the ground. The very notion of that is scary in itself. But it's to the aviation industry's incredible credit that it has managed to become the most successful form of transport. I mean, there's no other mode of transport that is safer than aviation. Probably walking may be comparison, but you probably get a heart attack from walking before you'll be in an aircraft accident. And let me just point out that this includes African aviation. 7 years ago, African aviation the African continental aviation had a very poor safety record. Programs were put in place by IATA, the IATA Operational Safety Audit, and that has made African aviation now one of the safest in the world as well. The risk has been managed to what would have up to now have been an unbelievable extent. And I honestly believe that we can reassure all passengers that there is no significant risk in taking buying an airline ticket on an approved regulated airline.
Yeah. All right, Guy. Just finally, in every sense of the word, are we efficient when it comes to our airports then in South Africa, whether it be or Tambo or many of the others across the country?
I think that our checks are pretty good. I mean, no one's flagged them as being particularly dangerous. And there are often checks made, by people carrying fake bombs or guns and so on board to check whether they're getting picked up. I mean, we haven't had any incidents. That's a good sign. And I think that we would need to investigate a lot more about this particular incident of these training grenades, as to whether they actually were a breach of the security processes or not. But my understanding, or let me say my consideration of the current processes in place at AXA airports is that they're more than good enough to deal with all the likely or expected threats.